Revenge with Karen.
Is there a reason the client just asked if we were trying to insult their CEO? I asked, eyes glued to the video call subtitles while the room went awkwardly silent. Across the conference table, one of our senior sales guys, Mitch, who once called sushi wet bait, shrugged and mumbled, "I thought short-fingered dictator was just a fun nickname." I wanted to peel my own face off. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, I'd rewritten the entire cultural guidebook for the third time that quarter, because apparently the team still didn't grasp that hand gestures aren't universal, and certain idioms don't exactly translate across time zones. I'm fluent in 4 languages, but I've become fluent in something else too: corporate babysitting. It's amazing how fast a $38 million international contract can unravel over a mistranslated joke or a too casual shrug. And when it's unraveling, they don't call legal. They don't call the VP, they call me. But don't get it twisted, I'm not complaining. I'm just exhausted. 5 years I've been at this firm. 5 years of late-night calls with Tokyo. 5 years of catching things before they exploded and watching upper management take victory laps while I quietly translated their screw-ups into something less catastrophic. I don't even have an office. Get a rolling chair with one busted wheel that veers left when I breathe too hard. And they still call me the translator, like I'm just in there running Google subtitles and not holding the entire relationship with our biggest client together using duct tape, caffeine, and sheer willpower. And then came Connor, VP of Sales, fresh from some startup that crashed harder than my hope during Monday morning check-ins. He shook my hand the first day with that grip that screams, "Read one book on alpha energy." Then he pointed at my name badge and asked if I was the language girl. Not communications liaison, not international account lead. Language girl, like I was a Duolingo owl that somehow got a keycard. That was my first clue. The second clue, he started dropping in on my client calls and interrupting. Constantly. Even when I was mid-sentence, mid-translation, or mid-saving his ass from an accidental offense. He'd step in with, "She's trying to say is," like I was some toddler fumbling for words, instead of the only reason the client still trusted our firm after Mitch's comment about their national holiday being a bit dramatic. I should have seen it coming. Connor didn't like that the client deferred to me, that they asked questions and waited for my answer. He smiled through his teeth and thanked me in meetings, then joked in the break room that I translate feelings more than words. To his buddies, it was fluff, dead weight, replaceable. I laughed it off. At first, I've dealt with worse. Ego in a suit is nothing new, but something was shifting. Meetings were happening without me. Decks I created were being presented with my name missing. I asked to be looped in on strategy talks and got vague answers. "It's above your pay grade. It's mostly numbers talk. We'll update you later." Later never came. What did come were the late-night calls from our overseas client, confused and increasingly annoyed. "Why is tone changing?" they asked. "Why do we not hear from Patricia?" So I kept doing what I always did, patched things up, smoothed it over, fixed the broken pieces in the background. But I felt it, that creeping sensation in your gut when the air shifts in a room, when you're not being consulted anymore, just tolerated, until you're not. Oh, and real quick, before we dive deeper into this corporate horror show, if you've made it this far, consider tapping that subscribe button and throwing a like. It's like coffee for the team, keeps us going, keeps the stories coming. And let's be real, 95% of you are listening in your car or at work and haven't subscribed yet. You know who you are, anyway. One morning, I noticed my calendar access was restricted. Connor had locked the negotiation prep meetings, my meetings, the same ones I used to lead. And yet, every client call still began with, "Is Patricia joining us today?" Followed by a nervous shuffle from the new account guy, who once confused a contract clause with a restaurant menu item. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. They were phasing me out. The only problem, I already knew how this game ended. And Connor, God bless his smug, navy blue-suited soul, is about to play himself harder than a first-time Monopoly player who mortgages Boardwalk 2 by Baltic Avenue. The first time I found out I'd been excluded from a strategy meeting was from the janitor. Seriously, Miguel, bless his soul, walked past me one evening while I was catching up on translation notes and said, "They're still yelling about numbers upstairs. Your name came up a lot." I blinked. I wasn't invited to anything tonight. He looked confused, shrugged, said, "Pretty sure they mentioned Japan." Sounded tense. Then he emptied my trash can and left me sitting there like an idiot, staring at my screen, wondering when exactly I'd been demoted to ghost. I double-checked my inbox. No invite, no calendar event, nothing. A whole conversation about the $38 million renewal, the biggest international contract in our pipeline, and I wasn't even looped. Not as a consultant, not even as a language girl. That week, the client emailed me directly. Could you please explain the logic behind the new KPI metrics? We are concerned tone is becoming more aggressive. Aggressive. That's how they phrased it, but I knew what they meant. They felt the shift. They always did. These were people who read posture and pauses the way other folks read headlines. Connor's strategic tone was landing like a corporate slap. No cultural context. No nuance. Just sales bravado where diplomacy used to live. I took it upstairs, asked Connor about the new KPIs. His response, "Don't worry about it. We've got the big boys on it now." Then he clapped my shoulder like we were teammates after a beer league softball win and walked off. My skin crawled. It got worse. Later that week, I heard from Rachel, our HR whisperer and queen of office gossip, that Connor was bringing in an external solution. I raised an eyebrow. What now? She leaned in, practically vibrating with tea. Some buddy of his from college, speaks like 3 words of Japanese, total bro. Connor says he's going to modernize the tone of our outreach. Apparently he's amazing with Google Translate. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Then I realized she wasn't kidding. His replacement for me was a guy named Chad. I am not making that up. Chad, from Cornell. With a LinkedIn bio that said Global Synergy Evangelist. I don't know what the hell that means, but it sounds like something you get charged extra for in a timeshare scam. That same afternoon, the client asked again if I would be joining the upcoming renewal session. When I told them I hadn't received the invite, there was a long pause on the call. Then the COO said, very calmly, "We are surprised." That's their version of yelling. I knew that tone. It meant something was already breaking. I walked into the ladies' room, locked the stall door, and sat there for 10 minutes, staring at the floor tiles. Not crying, not yet. Just realizing in real time that I'd become a liability in someone else's ego play. I could wait it out. Hope someone upstairs pulled the brakes before they ran us off the cliff, or I could stop pretending I wasn't standing on the edge. So I got up, flushed the toilet for appearances, and walked back to my desk. That night, I opened a fresh folder on my personal laptop. Title, Exit Strategy Confidential. Inside, I started dragging files, old emails, translation notes, cultural summaries I'd written, a year's worth of conflict logs, Connor's tone-deaf suggestions. I wasn't going nuclear, yet. I was just gathering kindling. And then I did something I never thought I'd do. I messaged the client's COO, not through company channels, no paper trail, just a quiet DM on a professional network, disguised as a casual check-in. If I were ever to transition out of my current firm, would you still see value in what I bring to the table? He replied in under 10 minutes. Patricia, if you ever became available, we'd call it a win. I read that message 5 times. Then I closed my laptop and poured a glass of wine. It tasted like the end of something, or maybe the start. I started small, screenshots mostly, line from an email where Connor referred to me as support staff in a thread to the CFO. A Slack message where he told one of the junior analysts to run the Japan file by Chad first, Patricia's too in the weeds. That one stung. I was the weeds. I planted them, watered them, and built a perfectly manicured hedge maze out of them so these corporate toddlers wouldn't get eaten alive by cultural misfires. Now I was being told to keep quiet because some frat ghost with a business minor once watched Lost in Translation. I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to start swinging before I had to. But the way Connor operated, it wasn't going to be long before he swung first. So I built the file, one red flag at a time. I titled it Passive Aggression Q2 because gallows humor is cheaper than therapy. I asked for a quiet meeting with HR just to get a sense of where I stood. Told them I had some concerns, wasn't feeling looped in, wanted to make sure I was still aligned with company objectives. The HR rep smiled like I just complimented her cardigan and chirped, "You're still on the team, Patricia. Don't overthink things. We love your enthusiasm." Enthusiasm. That's what they call it when you work through holidays, manage 3 time zones in a day, keep your client from torching the entire account because someone in sales called their national festival cute. I left with nothing. No assurances. No offers to mediate. Just a sticky note with the word alignment written on it and a slightly more hollow feeling in my gut. Legal wasn't any better. I floated a question during one of their Ask Me Anything office hours. Hey, hypothetically, if someone's role was being systematically reduced without formal notice, but they still had key client trust, how would that play in terms of liability? The junior associate blinked and said, if you're not on a performance plan, it's probably not a concern. Great, not a concern, just my concern. The message was clear. No one was going to stop Connor. No one even saw a problem, because what was happening didn't look like sabotage, it looked like reorganization. It looked like strategy. I went home that night and reread the COO's message from the client. You'd be a dream addition if you ever left them. And something in me clicked. I stopped thinking like an employee, started thinking like a business. The next day, I opened a new browser window, found a business registration portal, paid $105, gave my new LLC a name, Bridgepoint Strategies. Sounded fancy enough to be taken seriously, but vague enough to not trigger red flags if someone stumbled across it in a Google search. I registered a P.O. box, bought a domain, and wrote a one-pager service outline. Nothing flashy. Just enough to say I exist. Legally, professionally, independently. I wasn't going to jump, not yet, but I wanted a parachute. And now I had one. One Connor didn't know existed. One HR didn't think I was smart enough to pack. And Chad couldn't spell if you spotted him the C, the H, and the D. Over the next few days, I tightened my documentation. Every call I was excluded from, I noted. Every time a client requested me and was redirected to Chad, I logged. I saved audio files when I could, printed email chains and filed them at home. My work computer stayed clean. My personal one, though, that thing was Fort Knox in a trench coat. I didn't tell anyone, not my work friends, not my sister, not even my cat. The only soul who knew what I was building was me, and I guess the barista at the corner coffee shop who started noticing my caffeine-fueled tabs open to contract templates and start up legal blogs. New venture? He asked once, sliding me my third espresso of the day. Maybe, I said, or just preparing for weather. And I was, because the winds were shifting. Could feel it in every meeting I wasn't invited to, in every silence that followed my name. They thought I'd go quietly, that I'd fade into the background and take my notes and my diplomacy and my damn fluency with me. But what they didn't know was this. The bridge they were so eager to burn was the only one still holding up the damn deal. And I'd just bought the matches. The conference room was freezing, like it always was when the execs wanted to feel sharp. I'd worn my charcoal blazer, the one with the stitched cuffs and silent pockets that made me feel a little less invisible. Not that it mattered. Connor had already decided how this show would go. Patricia, you'll sit over there, he said, motioning to a seat behind the main table, like I was the damn intern waiting to fetch coffee. Just stay quiet unless we ask for translation, yeah? He didn't even look at me when he said it. His focus was on Chad, who was fiddling with the HDMI cable and smirking like a kid about to cheat on a group project. Half the team was on site with us in the US office. The other half, the client's entire C-suite, was dialed in from Tokyo. This was it. Renewal day, $38 million on the line. 5 years of my work, my trust, my middle-of-the-night emergency calls, now funneled through a PowerPoint Connor barely understood and a bro who still mispronounced Keretsu. He sat where he told me, silent, small, boiling. The call kicked off with stiff pleasantries. Connor did his usual overcompensation, grinning too wide, calling the COO by his first name like they'd played beer pong together. I watched the Japanese team go polite mask blank, blinking slowly like they'd already started writing our obituary. The presentation moved forward like a limp marathon. Chad did the first walkthrough. Half of it was filler, half of it was straight-up incorrect. I caught at least 3 culturally insensitive references, including one slide labeled Eastern Mindset, Pros and Cons. I could feel the air thinning. Still, I said nothing. Then came the clause, the deal-breaker clause, a performance penalty agreement we'd spent months negotiating into oblivion last time. The client had made it crystal clear they wouldn't tolerate that language again. It was a matter of face, of respect. And Connor reintroduced it, bolded, framed as a competitive accountability metric. I shifted in my seat, my jaw clenched, my palms itched. The client COO spoke up gently. We are surprised to see clause 7.3 return. We were under the impression this was removed in previous negotiation, per Patricia's clarification. Connor glanced at me, then laughed. That must have been a misunderstanding. Patricia sometimes overcorrects, but I've cleaned it up. Opened my mouth. Actually, that clause, he cut me off. Patricia, I froze. He turned toward me, smiled like a shark smelling blood, and said, "This isn't your show anymore. You're here to translate, not editorialize." Silence. The kind that grows teeth. The client COO raised an eyebrow. The legal advisor on their side leaned forward. I saw the beginnings of a frown ripple across their entire row like a tide turning, so I stood up, calmly, deliberately. I stepped toward the screen, never raising my voice. I switched languages, fluent, crisp, formal, and in their native tongue I said, "My apologies for the confusion." The clause reappeared without my knowledge. I no longer represent this company's internal strategy. If you'd like continued alignment, I'd be happy to offer consulting, independent, of course. My rate is 15%. I am available immediately. Connor blinked like he'd just heard dolphins bark in Morse code. The client CEO responded instantly. "You are no longer with the firm?" Connor whipped around, stunned. "Wait, what? No, she's with us." I stayed still. "Am I?" And then he did it. The idiot did it. He looked at me, flushed red, and spat, "You're fired, Patricia, effective immediately." He said it in English, loud, firm, like he thought it made him powerful. What it made him was doomed. Room went dead quiet. The overseas screen filled with concerned faces. One executive whispered something I caught clearly. "She's the only reason we didn't drop this contract last cycle." Connor's mouth flapped, searching for dignity in the sudden vacuum. But it was too late. I'd already stepped away from the table, already picked up my notes. Calm, precise. "I'll leave my badge at the front desk," I said, and Connor looked at me like a man watching a bridge collapse that he thought was fireproof. "You just fired the translator," I said softly. "But more importantly, you just fired the only person in this room who understood what the hell was going on." Then I turned to the screen, bowed slightly in their custom, and spoke again, only to them. "Shall we continue?" The moment his words landed, "You're fired, Patricia." Effective immediately, there was no gasp, no dramatic soundtrack, just a slow, surreal quiet that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. The kind of silence that has gravity. The kind that announces something irreversible just happened. I didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't lunge across the table and throttle him, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't imagine it. Instead, I stood up, slowly, with the kind of stillness that makes people nervous. I straightened the papers in front of me, not that I needed them anymore, smoothed the front of my blazer with deliberate calm. My hands weren't shaking. I wasn't embarrassed. I wasn't even surprised. This was the moment I'd been building toward. I turned my body to face the screen, the client's team seated in their Tokyo office, watching like hawks from across the globe. And then I spoke. Not in English. Not the diluted, overly sweetened version of corporate drivel Connor had been slinging all morning. No. I switched to their language. Not stiff textbook formal either, but fluent. Confident. Laced with respect, precision, and most importantly, authority. "Gentlemen," I said, bowing slightly, "there appears to have been a shift in internal alignment here today. As of now, I no longer speak on behalf of this firm. However, should you wish to continue this conversation with the cultural clarity and legal accuracy we've built over the last 5 years, I am available for immediate external consultation. My rate is 15%. All materials remain in my possession. I would be honored to continue working with you independently." The COO's eyes widened. One of the client advisors leaned back in his chair and looked off-screen, clearly processing what had just been said. The lead negotiator cleared his throat and said, very plainly, in English this time, "You just fired your liaison?" Connor blinked. She's not a liaison. She's a translator." And she went off script. The client CEO raised an eyebrow. "She's the only reason we renewed last time." Another client whispered something under his breath, and the room on their end shifted, murmurs, exchanged glances, a sudden conference on mute. They were recalibrating. The bridge hadn't burned. It had just moved. I turned back to Connor. He looked completely lost. "Wait a minute," he said, suddenly realizing the walls were closer than he thought. You can't take the relationship. It belongs to the firm." I smiled, tired, patient, like someone explaining quantum mechanics to a toddler with a foam baseball bat. "Connor," I said, still in front of the client screen, "they don't belong to anyone. They're not furniture. They're a sovereign billion-dollar partner who chose to deal with this firm through me. And now you've removed me." His mouth opened to argue. I didn't give him the chance. "To be clear," I added, turning slightly toward the camera again, "I do not have access to any proprietary data belonging to the firm. What I do have is 5 years of cultural context, policy history, trust, and client-developed communication protocols, all of which were authored by me as part of my role, and none of which are covered under the firm's NDA, which expired last quarter without renewal. That part hit like a hammer wrapped in silk. Because I knew, and he didn't, no one had bothered renewing the non-competes or updating the client-specific NDA since restructuring began. I'd been waiting for him to slip, and he just did, in front of witnesses. One of the Tokyo team members turned to the others and muttered something I didn't catch. The next thing I heard was, "We'd like to pause and recalibrate the call. Could we reconvene in 2 hours?" Connor tried to save face. Of course, totally. We're flexible. They weren't talking to him anymore. I gathered my things with unhurried hands. My notes, my water, the pen I'd brought from home, the one with the quiet click. I tucked it into my purse like a period at the end of a sentence. On my way out, I turned one last time to the screen and gave a small bow. "Gentlemen, thank you. I'll await your correspondence." Then, to Connor, I added quietly, without venom, just steel, "You just made your boldest move. Let's see how it ages." And I walked out of that frozen tomb of a boardroom with my head high, my spine straight, and the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Because the game had just shifted, and I wasn't the pawn anymore. I didn't cry when I left the building, didn't look back, didn't even pause to savor the moment. I just walked out through the glass lobby doors, past the same receptionist who used to nod at me every morning like we were both extras in someone else's movie. Today, she avoided eye contact, probably told to. The system had already revoked my badge by the time I reached the exit, swiped it once for good measure, just to feel the soft rejection of the red light blink. Cold, efficient, like me, apparently. No one followed, no one stopped me, not a whisper of farewell. 5 years boiled down to a silent hallway and the hum of recycled air. But as I stepped into the parking lot and closed my car door behind me, the vibration in my pocket lit up like a thunderclap. Email from Toshiro Matsuoka, COO subject, Patricia's Consulting offer body. Please confirm availability. We would prefer to engage directly moving forward. Retainer fee acceptable. Contract draft forthcoming. I read it 3 times, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was over. The line had been crossed, the break made clean. And Connor, he was still inside, probably chest-puffing to his sales team like he'd just single-handedly steered us through a geopolitical chess match. Oblivious, arrogant, dumb as concrete in a rainstorm. The retainer agreement came through 3 hours later. By 9 p.m., I'd forwarded it to my newly minted LLC email address. Bridgepoint Strategies now had its first official client. And not just any client, their client, the crown jewel, the one Connor thought he could muscle through with buzzwords and overcompensation. Back at headquarters, the fallout started almost instantly. The client's legal rep sent a formal note requesting all further communications regarding the renewal go through me exclusively. They cited previous working relationship, cultural fluency, the need for unified translation and negotiation voice. It was the politest corporate middle finger I'd ever seen. Legal at my former firm lost it. I know this because Rachel from HR, bless her petty little heart, called me from her personal number while sipping a white wine spritzer on her balcony. "They're scrambling," she said. "Connor's calling it a strategic pivot. He told the CFO you were freelancing with permission." I almost choked. Permission. He fired me? In public, I know. Legal knows. Half the floor knows. But he's telling the CEO this is part of a longer-term alignment plan. I let the silence hang. "Also," she added, "someone finally noticed you weren't under an active NDA for the renewal terms." Ah, there it was. That sweet, rotten fruit I'd been waiting to fall. Technically, I had signed an NDA when I first started. It was never updated to reflect the client-specific negotiations after our org structure changed. And the renewal? That was covered under a separate clause, which expired 90 days ago. I knew because I asked for a copy 6 months back, and no one ever sent it. Classic oversight. Convenient for me. Damning for Connor. Now it wasn't just a pivot. Now it was potential liability. The CEO, who had never once spoken to me in 5 years, suddenly appeared on every forwarded email thread. I could almost hear the panic behind his ellipses. Wait, she wasn't on an NDA for that deal. Who approved this clause without her? Why wasn't legal looped when she exited? Connor's responses were pure improv. We didn't expect the client to move this quickly. We assumed Patricia's departure would be quieter. There was miscommunication around her contractual status. Translation, we thought she'd go quietly. Instead, walked out with the one thing none of them understood: trust. The kind that doesn't come from job titles or org charts. The kind you build in midnight phone calls and crisis control meetings, in translating not just words but intentions. The kind you can't fake with LinkedIn flair or a college buddy named Chad. I didn't reply to their emails, not directly. I had no obligation anymore. I was a vendor now. And in this new game, I wrote the invoice. One clean email. Subject line: engagement confirmation Bridgepoint strategies. Attached, my terms: $7,500 retainer, 15% negotiation fee, weekly reporting cadence, direct billing. Sent, received, accepted. And while Connor fumbled for explanations, for paperwork that didn't exist and a narrative that no longer held, I opened a bottle of champagne from the back of my pantry, one I'd been saving for a moment I couldn't quite define until now. I didn't toast to revenge, or power, or even freedom. I toasted to clarity. Because when you're no longer on the inside trying to prove your worth, the outside feels like sunlight. It didn't take long for the pendulum to swing. Within a week, I was no longer dialing into meetings from the corner of a crowded conference room. I was hosting them, my name on the invite, my logo on the header, my voice leading the negotiations. Connor still tried to assert dominance on the first call post-firing, hopping on with that overcompensating smile and flanked by Chad, whose presence was about as helpful as a wet napkin in a grease fire. He opened with, "We're happy to align on Patricia's transition as a vendor. Of course, we'll continue managing the core negotiation." I cut him off. In their language, not for drama, but for precision. "Just to clarify," I said calmly, "the client has engaged me as the primary liaison. I will be leading the contract translation, clause review, and cultural calibration. If your firm wishes to propose adjustments, submit them to me in writing, and I'll review with their legal." There was a beat of silence. The COO gave the faintest nod, and just like that, Connor was out of the pilot seat. From that point forward, he was a passenger. I began dismantling his pitch deck clause by clause. Found 2 language inconsistencies in their SLA proposal. Caught a misused term in the risk assessment that could have triggered tax complications abroad. I flagged everything. Explained the context clearly, directly to the client, then offered alternative language based on our previous successful framework. They listened. They always had. Only now, I wasn't patching up messes behind the curtain. I was the one redlining the script. At first, Connor tried to play nice. Sent me a series of let's collaborate emails filled with vague suggestions and unsolicited tips, phrases like lean into synergy and smooth out the friction. I responded with bullet point lists of legal discrepancies and cultural missteps. One by one, he stopped replying. Then came the clause that broke him. The client sent over a revised engagement proposal to his firm, stating explicitly that all future communication regarding the renewal be routed through my office. Not legal, not sales, not Connor, just me. The request was phrased politely, but the implication was a slap: "We trust her, not you." They started pulling back, scaling down renewal scope, pushing back deadlines, declining internal presentations. Connor panicked and tried to schedule an urgent strategy session with the client to repair the relationship. COO replied with one line: "Please coordinate with Patricia." That's when it happened. The board started asking questions. Word travels fast in firms like ours, especially when revenue forecasts start wobbling. Rachel from HR called me again, her voice gleeful like a kid narrating a soap opera. "The CFO's pissed," she said. "Apparently Connor never disclosed the NDA lapse, and now the board's wondering how we let the core account slip to a former employee." I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. The scoreboard was already updating in real time. A few days later, I was invited to a virtual session with the client's entire expansion team, something that used to be reserved exclusively for executive sponsors. At the end of the call, the CEO leaned in and said, "Patricia, thank you for defending our interests. Even when you were with them, we knew where your loyalty really lived." I nodded. Just nodded, because that was the thing Connor never understood. He thought I was his competitor now, that this was a hostile takeover, but I wasn't trying to destroy his house. I was just protecting mine. When the next set of revisions came through, I added a clause of my own, a non-interference provision. The firm would be allowed to maintain service delivery, but all cultural and contract-level decisions would go through my consultancy. Connor tried to object, actually sent a reply to the client suggesting that perhaps Patricia is too emotionally invested in the transition. The client's CEO didn't even blink. Emotion has nothing to do with it, he said. Patricia understands us. You do not. Let's proceed. That call ended with Connor's video mysteriously disabled, his voice distant and robotic like someone talking through a pillow. Afterward, I leaned back in my chair, sipping coffee from a mug that read "The bridge is closed for repairs." This wasn't revenge. It was correction. And Connor, he was now exactly where he put me, watching from the sidelines, wondering when the floor disappeared. The audit wasn't even meant to uncover anything. It was part of a routine quarterly compliance review, just a tick-box exercise to appease the finance team and keep legal from chewing their nails to the bone before the fiscal close. But this time, someone actually read the files. Not just skimmed, read, and buried inside a cluster of folders labeled Intel Client Protocols, they found a pattern. My name, not just on emails or footnotes, but as the author of dozens of documents that had become foundational to the firm's dealings with the Tokyo client. Reports on cultural conflict mitigation. Adjusted legal language for cross-border clause translations, even cybersecurity briefs that had prevented 2 data transfer violations. All of them stamped, prepared by Patricia Morneau. Quietly, repeatedly, for over 2 years. Turns out, when legal had asked me to take a look at something real quick or write it up in a way they'll understand overseas, I'd ended up drafting the very documents they were now auditing. Not reviewed, not co-authored. Written. One of the internal compliance officers flagged it in her notes. Appears Patricia Morneau functioned in dual capacity as liaison and de facto compliance lead for Intel account. This was never formalized in role structure. Connor had no idea. Of course he didn't. He thought I was just the language girl with a nice accent and a better memory. He didn't know I'd spent weekends redrafting breach alerts. The reason our client never once levied a penalty was because I'd caught half a dozen errors before legal even logged into the portal. The audit report hit the boardroom 2 days after my firm was pushed into support-only status by the client. And Connor, he wasn't invited to the initial review. But I was told later what happened inside. One of the board members, a silver-haired man who rarely raised his voice, slapped the audit file onto the table and said, loud enough to echo, "You fired the backbone, to feel bigger." Connor stammered something about hierarchy and team dynamics and organizational alignment, but by then, no one was listening. They were flipping through pages with my name on them and realizing they'd built their tallest ladder on a beam they never bolted down. Rachel called me again, 3rd time in a month. "They're eating him alive," she whispered. "The founder's back in town, got flown in early. There's talk of reassignments, maybe even restructuring." I thanked her and hung up, and then I saw it. Buried between 2 client invoices in my inbox was an unexpected subject line. Lunch, no sender name, just an unfamiliar address. I opened it. "Patricia, my name is Harold Denton. I'm the founder of your former firm. I've read the audit, and I've read the contract your new firm sent to our former client. I'd like to have lunch. Just the 2 of us. No agenda, my treat. There's a little place in Pasadena where I used to take new hires who showed promise. I think it's overdue. Respectfully, Harold." I stared at the email like it was a glitch in the Matrix. Harold Denton hadn't been involved in day-to-day operations for years. He'd become a figurehead, someone they paraded around at events to shake hands and nod at slides he never read. I'd met him once, maybe twice, in passing. He'd never looked at me long enough to remember my name. Now he was inviting me to lunch. I replied simply, "Tell me the time, I'll be there." Because this wasn't about flattery. It wasn't even about revenge anymore. This was the moment the truth had fully arrived. Not in whispers, not in slaps on the back or passive-aggressive email chains, but in printed reports and audit logs and the unmistakable trail of receipts I'd spent years quietly producing while they ignored the sound of me holding up their ceiling. Didn't just overlook me, they stood on me. And now the foundation was gone. Let's see how the structure holds. The boardroom looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just outgrown it. Same long table, same overpriced art on the walls pretending to understand modern commerce. But this time, the air felt different, tighter, like the room itself knew something was about to shift and was holding its breath. Connor was already seated when we walked in, me, a black suit that didn't apologize for anything, and the client delegation in full attendance. Toshiro, the coup, walked at my side like we were old friends. We were, Not in the way Connor would ever understand, but in the way that gets contracts signed and trust built one hard-earned, sleepless week at a time. Connor gave a little smirk when he saw me, leaned back in his chair like a guy waiting for tennis serve he thought he could return. Then the door opened again. In walked Harold Denton, founder, name on the building, ghost of Christmas past. Connor's smirk collapsed like a wet sandcastle. "Harold," he said, half standing. "I didn't know you'd be." "You didn't," Harold replied, his voice calm but heavy like a piano falling through a ceiling. "I asked not to be added to the agenda. This is more of an observation." He nodded to me and took a seat. Not at the head. Just off to the side, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Opened my folder without ceremony. Inside was the document they all expected, the final draft of the client renewal contract. But this version had a few small changes. I slid one copy across the table to Connor. "This is the updated draft," I said. He started scanning it, eyes skimming, then pausing, then narrowing. About halfway down page 2, the color drained from his face. There, in clean black ink, under the line labeled Primary Liaison of Record, the name Bridgepoint Strategies LLC, and beneath that, Patricia Morneau, Principal Consultant. He looked up, stunned. "This isn't the version we approved." "No," I said, folding my hands neatly. "This is the version the client approved." Connor turned to the client, desperate. "This isn't standard procedure. We typically review these clauses internally." Toshiro spoke softly but firmly. "You were given the opportunity. We've elected a different path." Connor opened his mouth again. Harold cut in. "Actually, there's something else." The room stilled. Even the assistant taking notes looked up. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document, laid it flat on the table. His hand didn't tremble. He'd done this before. "We've sold our interest in that vertical," he said, gesturing toward the papers, effective immediately. Connor blinked. "Sold it? To who?" Harold looked at me, then back at him. "To Patricia's firm. At a fair price. Board voted this morning. I facilitated the terms." You could hear a pin drop. Connor's voice cracked. You can't just." "I can," Harold said, "and I did. Because you let arrogance outweigh value. You fired the person holding the account together. Then you lied about it. Then you tried to spin your failure as a strategy. But the audit doesn't lie. The client doesn't lie, and Patricia, she didn't need to." Connor looked at me like he was seeing a ghost with teeth. Didn't gloat, didn't blink. Just turned to the client, nodded once, and spoke in their language. "Shall we continue?" They all nodded. I began walking them through the revised terms, clear, strong, aligned with every cultural nuance I'd spent years mastering. The conversation flowed like it used to. Efficient, mutual, human. Connor didn't say another word. When the meeting ended, the client stood, bowed, and shook my hand first. Harold walked over after they left, slid his phone into his pocket, and said quietly, "I should have paid more attention." I gave him a smile. Better late than never. He nodded once and walked out. Connor remained seated, eyes glazed, hands still on the table like he was waiting for someone to hand him a better ending. I didn't. I packed my things and left. Outside, the sun was sharp, slicing through the glass like a blade. I felt it on my face as I walked to the elevator, weightless, like someone who had just returned from war, not bitter, not broken, just done. And this time, I didn't need a badge to walk out like I owned the place. Because now, in a way that mattered, I did. Appreciate you sticking around, you wise old rebels. Smash that subscribe button, or this fossil might just cause another epic fiasco.